Beneath the crowns and castles lies a kingdom of secrets. For 1,000 years, England's royals have ruled, rebelled, and unraveled in scandals, whispered behind velvet curtains and screamed across tabloid headlines. This isn't the history they teach you in school. These are the 33 most scandalous royal moments ever recorded affairs, betrayals, disappearances, and disasters that shook the throne and shattered illusions. You're about to see the monarchy like never before, up close, unfiltered, and unmistakably human. Welcome to 33 Most Scandalous English Royal Facts, where the past has a crown and a body count. Before we dive in, if you love untangling history's darkest corners and peeling back the royal facade, make sure to subscribe. It helps the channel grow, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. And while you're here, drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight? Noon? Somewhere in between? Let's see how far this royal rabbit hole reaches. The suspicious death of King William II Rufus, 1100. By the time King William II was struck by an arrow in the New Forest, he had already collected a generous pile of enemies, clerics, barons, even his own family. So when the king's lifeless body was unceremoniously carted back to Winchester on the back of a peasant's cart, eyebrows weren't just raised, they were permanently arched. Let's set the scene. It's the 2nd of August, 1100, a sunny day in southern England. The New Forest, ironically planted by William's own father, William the Conqueror, who cleared out entire villages to make it his personal hunting ground, plays host to a royal hunting party. Among those in the group are Walter Tyrrell, a French nobleman and supposedly the best shot in the party, William's younger brother Henry, who just happened to be in the area, and several other unnamed nobles, whose memories of the day would later become conveniently very foggy. Then it happens. A sharp twang, a rustle, and a king is suddenly face down with an arrow in his chest. Walter Tyrrell is said to have fired it, aiming for a deer, or maybe he wasn't aiming at all. Maybe he was aiming too well. Tyrrell didn't hang around to explain he fled the country immediately, which, in fairness, doesn't scream accidental manslaughter. Henry, that conveniently local brother, wasted no time. While William's body lay cold in the forest, Henry galloped to Winchester and seized the royal treasury. Within days, he was crowned Henry I of England. The message? Tragedy? Yes, but also opportunity. At least for some. Now, to be fair, medieval hunting accidents were not exactly rare. Arrows flew with chaotic energy. Everyone wanted the kill shot. It wasn't hard to imagine someone getting skewered in the excitement. But that explanation sits uncomfortably beside the fact that William Rufus was not a popular man. He had taxed the church ruthlessly, openly mocked the clergy, and ran a court so bawdy it made his father look like a monk. He also never married, had no known heirs, and wasn't exactly the model of medieval masculinity that chroniclers preferred to glorify. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, typically reserved in tone, couldn't resist calling him hated by almost all his people. Subtle. Some even speculated the forest itself was cursed. William's brother Richard had also died there years earlier, under uncertain circumstances. The New Forest, it seems, was no place for sons of conquerors. There was no formal inquiry, no royal investigation, and no one, not even Henry, seemed particularly interested in demanding answers. It was, officially, an accident. Unofficially, one of the most suspicious regime changes in English history. Think less Game of Thrones and more medieval HR reshuffling by crossbow. But here's the irony. Even if it was murder, it was the kind of murder that made the monarchy stronger. Henry I turned out to be an effective ruler, far more admired than his brother. So, if someone did pull the string intentionally, well, it worked. Sometimes the arrow that kills a king also sharpens the crown. And just as the dust settled around William's abrupt exit, the English monarchy found itself tangled in a scandal even more violent, even more dramatic, and even more liturgical. The murder of Archbishop Thomas Becket, 1170. The altar of Canterbury Cathedral is not the first place you'd expect a political hit to go down. But then again, 12th century England wasn't known for subtlety or stability. And Thomas Becket wasn't just any cleric. He was the kind of inconvenient priest kings have nightmares about. Stubborn, charismatic, and, most importantly, politically disobedient. Becket had once been King Henry II's closest friend. Drinking companions, strategy partners, co-conspirators in the grand theatre of medieval power. Henry had elevated Becket to Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162, expecting obedience. What he got instead was divine defiance. Becket took the job seriously, too seriously, in Henry's eyes. He began defending the church's autonomy, refusing to let royal courts try clergy, and blocking laws that would make priests more accountable to secular authority. Henry, used to being obeyed, didn't take it well. Their bromance devolved into ecclesiastical warfare. Becket fled to France. Negotiations failed. Letters flew. Threats were exchanged. And finally, Becket returned to England in 1170 like a liturgical firebrand, excommunicating bishops left and right and daring the crown to stop him. That's when Henry, in one of history's more catastrophic tantrums, is said to have cried out something like, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" And, as it turns out, 4 knights took that as a formal invitation. On the 29th of December, 1170, they marched into Canterbury Cathedral and found Becket standing before the altar. Accounts differ, but the gist remains the same. There was shouting, there were swords, and soon there was blood on the stones of the most sacred site in England. One blow allegedly sliced off the crown of his skull, another struck with such force the sword broke on the floor. The horror was immediate. Becket's martyrdom shocked Europe. Pilgrims flocked to Canterbury. Miracles were reported. The church began its campaign to sanctify him before the body was even cold. Becket became a saint, a symbol, and most inconveniently for Henry, a permanent rebuke carved in stone. Henry, by then realizing that threatening a bishop and triggering a national crisis was not excellent PR, performed public penance. He walked barefoot through Canterbury, submitted to flogging by monks, and wept at Becket's tomb. Sincere remorse? Or damage control? That part's up for debate. But what isn't debatable is this. Becket's murder, meant to secure royal authority, backfired spectacularly. Henry's legacy became forever entangled with the corpse in the cathedral. The monarchy had tried to silence the church. Instead, it gave it a martyr. And as Becket's blood soaked the altar, the crown found itself implicated in yet another vanishing act, not of a saint this time, but of a royal heir. A boy named Arthur, who disappeared under mysterious circumstances. And his uncle just happened to be king. 2 kings down, 31 scandals to go, and we're just getting started. If you're already hooked, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next twist in the royal wreckage. And tell me, where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight history binge? Morning scandal session? Let me know in the comments. King John and the Disappearance of Arthur of Brittany, 1203. Before King John was known as the villain of Robin Hood tales, he was a flesh and blood royal, standing at the uneasy intersection of failure, fear, and a very real missing person case. That person? His own nephew, Arthur of Brittany, a teenager with a legitimate claim to the English throne. And one day, without warning or explanation, Arthur simply vanished. The year was 1203. The Plantagenet family, like most royal houses of medieval Europe, treated loyalty like an optional accessory. King John, the youngest son of Henry II, had become king in 1199 after the death of his older brother, Richard the Lionheart. But John's claim wasn't without competition. His late brother Geoffrey, sandwiched between Richard and John in the birth order, had left behind a son, Arthur. And by the logic of primogeniture, Arthur had the stronger claim. Arthur was born in 1187 and raised in Brittany, a French duchy with a long history of complicated relationships with both the English and the French crowns. He had a strong base of support, especially in the territories across the Channel, and most fatally for John, the backing of the King of France, Philip II. In the chessboard politics of the time, this made Arthur not just a nuisance, but an existential threat. At first, it was just politics as usual. Two rival claimants, two camps of supporters, the usual diplomacy by sword. But then came the turning point. In 1202, Arthur was captured by John's forces during a nighttime siege in Mirabeau, where he'd been attempting to imprison his own grandmother, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Yes, the drama ran deep in this family. John, for once in his life, reacted swiftly and decisively. He not only captured Arthur, but also several high-ranking rebel nobles. This was, strategically, a huge win. What happened next, however, is where the clean lines of history blur into fog. Arthur was taken to Rouen, the power centre of John's Norman territories. He was kept in custody, and then silence. By early 1203, rumours began to swirl. Arthur was dead. Some claimed he'd been murdered in a drunken rage by John himself. Others suggested the king had ordered it done discreetly. Some whispered of a nighttime escape attempt, thwarted with fatal consequences. Others believed Arthur had been quietly transferred elsewhere, out of sight, out of mind, perhaps to some lonely prison or monastery, buried under a false name. But the fact remained, he was gone. There was no trial, no official record, no explanation, and certainly no body. In a kingdom already uneasy with John's competence and ruthlessness, this was not a good look. The political fallout was swift. French nobles, outraged by the disappearance of the teenage duke, turned further against John. Philip II of France used it as a pretext to declare John's continental lands forfeit. Over the next few years, John lost nearly all his holdings in France Normandy, Anjou, and Maine. Centuries of Plantagenet territory gone, thanks in part to one mysterious vanishing and the rumours that followed it like vultures. And what about John's reputation back home? It plummeted. Chroniclers dubbed him John Lackland for his territorial losses. They also accused him of every sin short of conjuring demons, although, if he had, they probably would have noted that too. He taxed the barons until they were bled dry, alienated the church, and picked fights with just about everyone who could swing a sword or a pen. The vanishing of Arthur became one of many black marks on a reign riddled with paranoia and public relations disasters. This, ultimately, was one of the sparks that would ignite the most famous constitutional crisis in English history. By 1215, the barons had had enough. They forced John to sign the Magna Carta, a document intended to limit royal power and assert noble rights. It was, in a way, a national restraining order against the king. And while it would be torn up, revised, and reissued over the years, its legacy endured. The idea that a monarch wasn't above the law, That began, in part, with a king who might have made his nephew disappear. So what really happened to Arthur of Brittany? No one can say for sure. But the fact that John never offered an explanation, no body, no burial, no even semi-plausible excuse, meant the question lingered like a bad smell in a holy place. Even his contemporaries suspected the worst. And centuries later, historians still can't agree. Murdered? Secretly exiled? Died by accident? The truth, if it ever existed, died with the king. But the pattern was forming. Disappearances, power plays, suspicious silences. It was only the start. Because just over a century later, England would crown a young king whose reign would unravel in blood, betrayal, and one of the most bizarre royal bromances in its long, scandal-prone history, Edward II and his favourites. 1307, 1327. Some kings rule with an iron fist, others with a gilded crown. Edward II ruled, or tried to, with a velvet-gloved hand wrapped tightly around his favourites, which wouldn't have been such a problem if it hadn't cost him the kingdom, the respect of his nobles, and eventually his very throne. The reign of Edward II was less a tale of statecraft and more a medieval cautionary romance, part political tragedy, part courtly melodrama, and entirely scandalous. Edward succeeded his father, Edward I, in 1307. His father had been a warrior king, a tall, ruthless commander known as the Hammer of the Scots. By contrast, Edward II preferred music, pageantry, and the company of one man in particular, Piers Gaveston. Gaveston was a Gascon knight of modest birth who had somehow captured the prince's attention years earlier and was elevated beyond all reasonable expectation. He was made Earl of Cornwall, showered with lands and honours, and given power that made many of England's most powerful barons feel like props at their own feudal theatre. To say the nobles were unhappy would be putting it politely. They saw Gaveston not just as an upstart, but as an insufferable peacock mocking their customs, flaunting his influence, and reducing their authority to a running joke at court. Contemporary chroniclers don't even try to hide their disdain. The barons demanded his exile more than once, and Edward grudgingly complied only to recall Gaveston in secret, again and again, like a teenager sneaking out to see a banned paramour. Eventually, the nobles lost patience. In 1312, a group of them, led by Thomas of Lancaster, seized Gaveston and executed him without royal approval. The king, understandably, was devastated. But this wasn't the moment Edward toughened up and took charge. Instead, he floundered. He let his grief spill into policy, continued alienating allies, and made one ill-fated political decision after another. The next chapter in Edward's pattern of ruinous favouritism came with the Despensers, first Hugh the Elder, then Hugh the Younger. The Despensers weren't just courtiers, they were power-hungry tacticians who leveraged Edward's affection into a near monopoly on influence. Their rise was marked by aggressive land grabs, legal manipulations, and purges of rival barons. And just like Gaveston, they became symbols of everything wrong with Edward's reign. By the 1322nd, England was in chaos. Civil war simmered. The Queen, Isabella of France, who had once been the king's diplomatic bridge to the continent, became estranged and politically sidelined. She was ignored at court, humiliated by the Despensers, and treated as little more than a dynastic inconvenience, until she wasn't. In 1326, Isabella turned the tables. While in France under the pretense of diplomacy, she formed an alliance with Roger Mortimer, a disgraced English noble living in exile. And then scandalously, strategically they invaded. It wasn't a full-scale war. It didn't need to be. By this point, Edward had burned too many bridges. The nobility rallied to Isabella and Mortimer. The Despensers were captured and executed. Edward fled, but was caught, imprisoned, and forced to abdicate in favour of his son, Edward III. Then comes the final mystery: Edward's death in 1327. Officially, he died in captivity at Berkeley Castle. The records are suggestive. They mention a private death, a suspicious lack of witnesses, and a reign so disgraced that it needed a quiet conclusion. Later rumours, some lurid, some theatrical, speculated on how he died. But as with so many royal exits, what matters isn't the method, but the motive. A king too fixated on his chosen few, too indifferent to his kingdom, had become a liability. His removal was less a crime of passion and more a matter of national hygiene. Edward II's reign remains one of the great, tragic misfires of English monarchy. A ruler with no sense of balance, no political instinct, and too much blind loyalty to those who used him for their own gain. He ruled as if court life were a love letter, only to discover that the barons preferred declarations of war. But power vacuums never stay empty for long, and the man who stepped into that vacuum would write his own chapter of treachery, not by loving too much, but by punishing too often. Richard II's Tyranny and Deposition, 1399. If Edward II was the king who loved too much, Richard II was the king who remembered everything. Every slight, every insult, every barbed whisper in the shadows of court. He was the type to hold a grudge longer than he held on to power, and in the end, it was his obsession with retribution that unmade him. Richard II became king in 1377, at the tender age of 10. His grandfather, Edward III, had ruled for half a century and left a kingdom groaning under the weight of wars and taxes. Richard's reign began under a regency council, but even as a child, he displayed the flint-edged pride that would come to define his rule. The first major test came with the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. To his credit, Richard rode out to meet the rebels personally, promising reforms and buying time. Then, once the revolt had cooled, he had the leaders hunted down and executed. Charm, followed by iron. It would become a pattern. As he matured, Richard grew more theatrical and more isolated. He was obsessed with the idea of divine kingship rule not by merit, but by the grace of God, absolute and unquestioned. He surrounded himself with sycophants and lavished gifts on favourites. But where Edward II had played favourites out of sentiment, Richard did so out of strategy and vanity. In 1387, a group of nobles known as the Lords Appellant rose up to curb his excesses. They defeated his forces, executed several of his advisors, and forced Richard into a humiliating submission. But Richard wasn't the sort to forget. Over the next decade, he quietly rebuilt his power, sowed distrust among the nobility, and waited. In 1397, he struck back with calculated fury, arresting, exiling, or executing the very men who had once humbled him. It was a purge, royal style. But power built on vengeance is brittle, and Richard, by then increasingly despotic, overplayed his hand. Enter Henry Bolingbroke, Richard's cousin, the son of John of Gaunt, and a man with more political instincts than Richard ever managed. When Richard exiled Henry and later seized his inheritance, he gave his rival both motive and cause. While Richard was in Ireland attempting to shore up loyalty, Henry returned to England. He claimed he was only after his rightful lands. But as more nobles rallied to his banner, it became clear this was a full-blown regime change. Richard, caught off guard and politically isolated, surrendered without a fight. In 1399, he was forced to abdicate. Henry took the throne as Henry IV. Richard was imprisoned, likely at Pontefract Castle. Months later, he was dead. Officially, he died of starvation. Unofficially, a quiet execution ordered by the new king. But again, no trial, no burial with honours, just silence. What made Richard's fall so dramatic wasn't just the speed of it, it was the irony. He had styled himself as a monarch above politics, a divine figure immune to human pettiness. But in the end, he was dragged down by the very thing he'd tried to rise above, the unrelenting transactional logic of noble power. And yet, even after death, Richard remained a haunting presence. His downfall served as a warning to kings who thought themselves gods. It echoed through the centuries, referenced by Shakespeare, studied by historians, and feared by monarchs who knew the throne was never quite as secure as it looked. And speaking of insecure thrones, a century later, two royal boys would vanish into the shadows of the Tower of London, leaving behind a silence even darker than their locked chamber. The Princes in the Tower, 1483. The story begins like a fairy tale. Two young princes, a looming coronation, and a kingdom poised for continuity. But somewhere between the golden promise and the iron cage of royal politics, something went very, very wrong. Edward V, just 12 years old, and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, entered the Tower of London in 1483, and then they were never seen again. At the time, this wasn't unusual. The Tower wasn't yet the symbol of doom it would become. It was a royal residence and traditional lodging for monarchs in waiting. The elder of the two, Edward V, had just inherited the crown from his father, Edward IV. But the throne had barely cooled before vultures began to circle, none more prominent than Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the boy's uncle. Richard was appointed Lord Protector, a kind of royal babysitter with a sword. His official role was to safeguard the transition of power until Edward V came of age. But Richard was a man of contradictions, pious yet ruthless, dutiful yet deeply ambitious. Within weeks of Edward IV's death, Richard began reshuffling the political deck with suspicious speed. Loyal allies of the late king were arrested. The boy's maternal relatives, especially their formidable mother Elizabeth Woodville, were pushed aside. Then came the bombshell. A declaration that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid, possibly due to a pre-contract of marriage, or so Richard's allies claimed. This made the princes illegitimate in the eyes of the law. Convenient, since it cleared the path for Richard to take the throne as Richard III. And take it he did. Meanwhile, the boys remained inside the tower. No longer the staging ground for a coronation, it became their gilded prison. After the summer of 1483, they vanished. No public sightings, no royal funerals, no state proclamations. Just absence. A yawning political silence where two heirs used to be. Suspicions, of course, landed squarely on Richard III. Who else stood to benefit from their removal? Contemporary sources, including the famously gossipy Dominic Mancini, suggested the boys were seen less and less in public until they were no longer visible at all. Centuries later, Shakespeare would immortalize Richard as the hunched villain, whispering threats in the tower, dripping with Machiavellian contempt. But history, unlike drama, rarely provides neat endings. Were the princes murdered? Possibly. But by whom? Richard? Some overzealous subordinate? The Duke of Buckingham? Eager to curry favour? Or, as some revisionists argue, Henry Tudor, later Henry VII, who had just as much motive to erase the boys after defeating Richard at Bosworth in 1485. In 1674, two small skeletons were discovered under a staircase in the tower. Charles II had them reburied in Westminster Abbey as the lost princes. No formal investigation was conducted, and so the question lingered. The tragedy wasn't just in their disappearance, it was in what they represented, the terrifying fragility of innocence in the crossfire of royal ambition. Two boys, born into a golden cradle, consumed by the machinery of power before either could wield it. Richard III's reign would last just 2 years. He fell at the Battle of Bosworth to Henry Tudor, who promptly married the prince's sister Elizabeth to cement his claim. It was a brilliant political move, but one that did nothing to clarify what had happened to her brothers. History moved on. The Tudors rewrote the script. Richard became the villain. The boys became martyrs. And the Tower of London gained a new identity, not as a palace, but as a place where heirs disappeared, and silence screamed louder than any coronation trumpet. And while their fate remains one of England's most famous whodunits, the scandal that followed next would make disappearing heirs look almost subtle. Because now, we enter the court of the man who turned matrimony into policy, and left a bloody trail of wives behind him in pursuit of a son. Henry VIII's Great Matter, 1527–1533. It started with a problem only a king could have. His wife, Catherine of Aragon, had not produced a male heir. Plenty of monarchs faced this dilemma. Henry VIII, however, decided the answer was to defy the Pope, divorce a queen, marry her lady-in-waiting, and rupture the entire religious structure of Europe. Because when you're a Tudor, everything is personal, and everything is political. By 1527, Henry had been married to Catherine for nearly 2 decades. She was the daughter of the Catholic monarchs of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, and had been previously married to Henry's older brother, Arthur, who died shortly after their wedding. This created a complicated theological footnote. While the Pope had granted a dispensation for Henry to marry her, Henry later claimed their union had been cursed from the start. His reasoning? Leviticus. If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. They shall be childless. Never mind that they had a daughter, Mary. To Henry, a daughter didn't count. What he needed, deserved, was a son. And so began the Great Matter, a euphemism so famously understated it could only belong to the English court. Henry petitioned Pope Clement VII for an annulment, arguing that his marriage to Catherine had never been valid in the eyes of God. The Pope, caught in the geopolitical headlock of Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, dragged his feet. Denial followed delay, and Henry's patience began to fray. He was already enamored with Anne Boleyn, a young, sharp-witted noblewoman who had managed the impossible. She said no. Unlike Henry's other mistresses, Anne refused to be just another royal conquest. If he wanted her, she made clear, he would have to make her queen. For Henry, it was both a challenge and a test of power. Could he bend the church to his will? Could he outmaneuver the Pope himself? When Rome refused, Henry broke away. With the help of Thomas Cromwell and the newly empowered Thomas Cranmer, Henry rejected the authority of the Pope, declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, and annulled his marriage through English ecclesiastical courts. Catherine was stripped of her title. Anne was crowned queen in 1533. And just like that, Henry VIII had detonated the English Reformation. It wasn't just a marriage crisis, it was a full-blown religious, political, and social revolution. Monasteries would be dissolved, priests would be forced to swear oaths to the king, and across Europe, former allies would now view England as a rogue state, ruled by a king who had crowned himself Pope. The irony? Anne would fail to give him a son, too. But before her own story could crash into scandal and steel, Henry's Great Matter had already rewritten the monarchy's relationship with the divine, the people, and itself. Kings had always believed they ruled by the grace of God. Henry's real innovation was acting like he was God, at least in England. And as the dust of the annulment settled and Anne Boleyn took her place beside the king, a new era had begun. One built on defiance, ambition, and something that would become Henry's most enduring obsession: control. But what happens when control slips? When a queen becomes too clever, too independent, and too threatening? Anne Boleyn was about to find out. 7 scandals in, and somehow Henry VIII hasn't even started beheading people yet. If you're still with us clearly, you've got the right kind of curiosity. Go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss what's lurking around the next royal corner. And just for fun, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it right now? Late night dive? Lunchtime drama? Drop it in the comments. Anne Boleyn's fall, 1536. Anne Boleyn was never meant to survive the ending of her own fairy tale. She had begun as a scandal, risen as a queen, and ended up as a lesson, a brutal reminder that in the Tudor court, the favour of the king was a weather pattern, and no one, not even the queen, was immune to the storm. When Anne married Henry VIII in 1533, it wasn't just a royal wedding, it was the grand finale of the great matter, the seismic political and religious rupture that saw Henry break from Rome to secure a divorce from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Anne was crowned queen, hailed as the mother of a new dynasty, and expected to give England what it still desperately lacked: a male heir. She gave birth to Elizabeth, a healthy daughter. Brilliant, yes. Charismatic, certainly. But not the son Henry had gambled a church for. Anne's fortunes began to dim almost immediately after the birth. Miscarriages followed. The pressure mounted. Henry, who had once composed songs for her and declared her his one true love, began to look elsewhere, most notably toward Jane Seymour, a quiet, docile courtier who seemed everything Anne was not: compliant, unambitious, and unthreatening. But Henry didn't just tire of Anne. He began to blame her for the lack of a son, for the court's growing divisions, for the ceaseless drama that now defined his reign. Anne, for her part, was not the type to fade quietly. She was sharp-tongued, politically aware, and more than capable of defending her position. But that very strength, once so alluring, now became ammunition. The machinery of Anne's downfall began to turn in early 1536. In January, Catherine of Aragon died, removing the last obstacle to Henry's full marital legitimacy. Just days later, Anne miscarried a male fetus. Henry, reportedly distraught, saw it as a final confirmation. God had cursed this union. Enter Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister and political fixer. Cromwell had once been Anne's ally during the Reformation, but the two had since turned on each other. She wanted foreign alliances and charity reform. He wanted wealth via the dissolution of the monasteries. The Queen had become inconvenient, and Cromwell didn't deal in inconveniences. The charges, when they came, were as sensational as they were suspect. Anne was accused of adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, George Boleyn, treason, incest, witchcraft, the works. The trial was a masterpiece of political theatre, barely a pretense of justice, rushed testimonies, forced confessions. The accused were arrested, tortured, or pressured into submission. One man, Mark Smeaton, a court musician, confessed under duress. Others denied everything. Anne maintained her innocence to the end. On May 19, 1536, she was executed. Her death was swift, carried out by a French swordsman brought in for the occasion, a strange courtesy in an otherwise ruthless affair. The morning of her death, she gave a final speech praising the king. Historians still debate whether it was sincere, ironic, or the last desperate nod to self-preservation. Anne's story didn't end with her execution. Her daughter, Elizabeth would one day become one of England's greatest monarchs. Her rise would give retroactive dignity to her mother's memory. But in the moment, Anne was erased. Her portraits removed, her initials scrubbed from court decoration, her name spoken only in whispers. Yet something lingered. Not just the memory of a queen beheaded, but of a dangerous precedent, that the king's affection could turn into an accusation, that political convenience could become a death sentence, and that no crown sat too firmly on a queen's head when the king's eyes drifted elsewhere. And while Anne's body was barely cold, Henry's machinery of change rolled on, this time not in the royal bedchamber, but in the sacred spaces of England itself. The Dissolution of the Monasteries, 1536, 1541. "What do you do when you've broken from the Pope, declared yourself supreme head of the Church, and married a second queen? If you're Henry VIII, you start a nationwide liquidation sale of epic proportions. Enter the Dissolution of the Monasteries, a sweeping campaign that gutted centuries of religious tradition, plundered immense wealth, and forever altered the spiritual and economic landscape of England. The justification was pious on paper. Monasteries were corrupt, decadent, and full of idle monks living off the land. And sure, there were some documented excesses. But beneath the surface, the motives were more pragmatic. Monasteries controlled vast tracts of land, significant revenue streams, and loyalty that often bent toward Rome. That made them both inconvenient and enticing. To Henry and his minister Thomas Cromwell, they looked less like holy institutions and more like untapped assets. The process began cautiously in 1536, targeting smaller houses with incomes under £200 a year. But it didn't stay cautious for long. Bigger monasteries followed, agents were dispatched, inventories taken, property seized. Monks and nuns were pensioned off, or more often, left to fend for themselves. Sacred relics were destroyed, libraries burned, altars stripped. The state, newly emboldened, marched through cloisters with ledgers and soldiers alike. What was lost wasn't just wealth, but a social safety net. Monasteries had provided education, charity, medical care, and spiritual refuge. Their dissolution left a vacuum, especially in rural areas. Former tenants found themselves landless. Pilgrims found their shrines desecrated. Communities were hollowed out. Of course, not everyone went quietly. The most notable backlash came in the form of the Pilgrimage of Grace, a massive northern rebellion in 1536. Tens of thousands marched under religious banners, demanding the restoration of abbeys and the end of Cromwell's influence. Henry promised pardons, negotiated peace, and then executed the leaders anyway. Politically, the dissolution worked. The crown gained immense wealth, though. Henry, true to form, spent it quickly. Noble families loyal to the king were rewarded with monastic lands, tying them more closely to the Tudor regime. And the Church of England, now stripped of its old infrastructure, became a leaner, more controllable entity. But culturally and spiritually, something cracked. 1,000 years of monastic tradition erased in less than a decade. Sacred sites turned into sheep pastures, chapels into barns. Bells melted down for cannon, and the public, already uneasy with the rapid pace of religious change, now found itself alienated from the sacred heart of its daily life. Even Cromwell, the mastermind behind the campaign, wouldn't escape unscathed. Just a few years later, he would fall from Henry's favour, accused of treason, and meet his own fate. Another man executed by the same machine he had helped to build. The dissolution wasn't just a bureaucratic campaign, it was a psychological blow to the English soul. A reminder that sacredness was no match for power, that wealth always finds new owners, and that kings, when armed with divine authority, rarely stop at moderation. And just when the dust began to settle, Henry did what he did best. He married again and again and again, until finally another teenage queen would meet a fate tragically similar to Anne's. Not for power, not for politics, but for love, or at least what passed for it at the Tudor court. Catherine Howard's execution, 1542. By the time Catherine Howard entered Henry VIII's orbit, the Tudor court had already devoured 4 queens. One had been cast off, one had died, one had been beheaded, and one had managed miraculously to survive. You'd think that would have been enough warning. But history has a way of making the same mistake twice, especially when it comes wrapped in youth, beauty, and an alarming lack of political foresight. Catherine Howard was somewhere between 16 and 19 when she caught the eye of Henry, who was well into his 40s and increasingly unwell. He was already on his 5th marriage. His previous wife, Anne of Cleves, had been discarded after 6 months for being unattractive and, perhaps more crucially, politically inconvenient. Catherine, a cousin of the ill-fated Anne Boleyn and a member of the powerful Howard family, offered something new. She was young, flirtatious, and willing to flatter a king who desperately needed to feel desired. For Henry, who now suffered from ulcers, paranoia, and the emotional scars of 3 failed marriages, Catherine was like a restorative potion. He showered her with jewels, called her his rose without a thorn, and publicly displayed a level of affection that bordered on theatrical. For a brief moment, the court hummed with a sense of renewal. The old king had found new joy. But beneath the surface, Catherine's story was less fairy tale and more ticking clock. Before marrying Henry, Catherine had lived in the household of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, her step-grandmother, and her upbringing, to put it diplomatically, lacked supervision. She had engaged in flirtations, and possibly more, with men like Francis Derham, a secretary who later assumed he would marry her. These past indiscretions, once mere youthful rebellion, would become fatal liabilities once she wore a crown. And things didn't improve after the wedding. Once queen, Catherine allegedly resumed contact with Derham, who had returned to court and been appointed her secretary. Even more dangerously, she began a clandestine relationship, emotional, perhaps more with Thomas Culpeper, a favoured courtier of the king. The exact nature of their meetings remains disputed. What's less disputed is that they were secret, unchaperoned, and deeply unwise. In late 1541, rumours reached Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. Notes were passed, names whispered. An investigation was launched discreetly, and what it uncovered was politically explosive. Derham, under interrogation, confessed. Culpeper's name emerged. Letters were discovered, one from Catherine to Culpeper, breathless and romantic. And then the Queen herself was arrested. Henry was blindsided. The betrayal, if true, wasn't just personal, it was treason. The same charge that had ended Anne Boleyn's life now loomed over her teenage cousin. Catherine was stripped of her title, imprisoned, and after several weeks of investigation, condemned. Her execution in February 1542 was met with a cold, theatrical efficiency. According to accounts, she asked for the execution block the night before so she could practice laying her head upon it. Whether that detail is true or Tudor myth-making, it fits the pattern. Young women playing dangerous games in a court that offered no forgiveness. Catherine's downfall had less to do with rebellion and more to do with recklessness. She had neither the ambition of Anne Boleyn nor the caution of Jane Seymour. She danced through the corridors of power without realizing she was walking a tightrope and there was no safety net below. Her death marked yet another round in Henry's grim pattern. Elevate, idolize, scrutinize, destroy. And though Henry would marry once more after her, The reign of Catherine Howard left a particularly bitter aftertaste. She had been too young, too unguarded, and too trusting in a world where trust was a luxury few could afford. But if the court had grown used to beheadings, it wasn't prepared for the next scandal, a royal death that left behind no body, no killer, and no resolution. A fall, a staircase, and a decades-long echo of suspicion. Amy Robsart's mysterious death, 1560. The story begins with a woman found dead at the bottom of a staircase. That part is simple. It's everything else who she was, who stood to gain, and why it still haunts English history that complicates things beyond repair. Amy Robsart was the wife of Robert Dudley, the childhood friend and alleged favourite of Queen Elizabeth I. She married Dudley in 1550, a union of young romance or political convenience, depending on who was telling the story. For years, their marriage remained largely private, hovering in the background of the English court's more glittering narratives, until it didn't. By 1558, Elizabeth ascended the throne. Dudley became a constant presence at her side, master of the horse, close advisor, rumoured lover. The Queen, famously resistant to marriage, nevertheless allowed herself an unusual degree of intimacy with him, so much that foreign ambassadors wrote home about it, suggesting England's virgin queen might soon cease being quite so virginal. There was just one problem. Robert Dudley was still very much married, and while Amy rarely appeared at court, she preferred the countryside. Possibly for health reasons, her existence was a royal obstacle. No matter how favoured Dudley became, he could not marry Elizabeth while Amy lived. That made Amy's sudden death, on the 8th of September, 1560, not just tragic, but politically explosive. She was found at the foot of a staircase in Cumnor Place, a country house she had been living in separately from her husband. Her neck was broken. Some said she had fallen. Others whispered it was suicide. Still others more cynically suggested murder. The coroner's inquest ruled it an accident, but the timing was uncanny. Dudley's ambitions to marry Elizabeth were at their peak. Rumours spread with the efficiency of wildfire in dry grass. Nobles murmured. Foreign powers smirked. Elizabeth, acutely aware of public perception, distanced herself. Dudley, for all his charm and closeness to the Queen, would never quite recover from the stain of suspicion. For centuries, historians have picked through the possibilities. One theory? It really was an accident. Amy was reportedly unwell, possibly suffering from breast cancer or another debilitating illness. The stairs were steep, the house isolated. A tragic misstep, nothing more. Another theory? Suicide. Amy had reportedly sent all her servants away the day she died. A strange act, unless she intended to be alone. But suicide was considered both a sin and a crime in Tudor England, making it an unpalatable official conclusion. Then the darkest theory, murder, perhaps orchestrated by Dudley himself. Or, more plausibly, by ambitious allies who believed removing Amy would clear the path to royal marriage and would earn them favour in the new political order. But if that was the plan, it backfired spectacularly. Elizabeth was shaken. The public reaction was so poisonous that any talk of marriage between her and Dudley evaporated. She kept him close, too close, some said, but never gave him a crown. Amy's death had accomplished the opposite of what a would-be kingmaker might have wanted. It had made Dudley unmarriageable. The irony? Elizabeth would go on to rule for more than 4 decades, never marrying, her personal life forever shadowed by this early scandal. Dudley remained her favourite, but never more than that. And Amy Robsart, a woman history would have otherwise forgotten, became one of its permanent question marks. No charges, no confessions, no closure. Just a body on the stairs, and 1,000 whispered motives. And in the next chapter of Scandal, the staircases of power don't just host accidental deaths, they become the backdrop for dangerous intimacy, whispered favoritism, and royal relationships that leave the entire country on edge. James I and the Duke of Buckingham. 1602. When King James VI of Scotland inherited the English crown in 1603 and became James I of England, the Tudors were gone, the Elizabethan age was over, and Britain was about to enter an era of lavish flattery, literary brilliance, and deep political discomfort. James was a complex man, erudite, theologically obsessed, convinced of divine right, and perhaps most damning in the eyes of his critics, absolutely infatuated with a young courtier named George Villiers. George Villiers didn't come from much: minor gentry, good manners, and extraordinary good looks. But James saw something in him, something dazzling, something useful, something, perhaps, that reminded him that being king didn't have to mean being alone. Villiers was knighted in 1650. By 1616, he was Viscount, then Earl, then Marquess, then Duke of Buckingham. That's a social trajectory so steep it should have come with a harness. The speed of Villiers' rise wasn't just noted, it was resented. The old guard nobles who had waited decades to climb a rung watched as this upstart leapfrogged them in titles, influence, and proximity to the king. He controlled patronage, dominated foreign policy, and even managed access to the royal bedchamber. The term favourite in the Jacobean court wasn't just descriptive, it was loaded. The intimacy between James and Buckingham didn't go unnoticed. James, never subtle in his affections, wrote letters to Villiers dripping with tenderness. One read, "I desire only to live in this world for your sake. I had rather live banished in any part of the earth with you than live a sorrowful widow's life without you." Was it romantic? Political? Both? The lines blur, as they often do in royal correspondence. But the effect was clear. The court seethed. Parliament, already suspicious of James's tendencies toward absolutism, viewed Buckingham as a dangerous influence. He was blamed for foreign policy failures, extravagant spending, and meddling in the succession of court offices. When James tried to marry his son Charles to a Spanish princess, an unpopular Catholic match, it was Villiers who facilitated the diplomatic disaster. He and Charles travelled incognito to Spain in 1623, hoping to woo the Infanta in person. It didn't go well. The mission failed, Spain was insulted, and public outrage skyrocketed. James, undeterred, clung to Buckingham. It didn't matter how badly the trip went or how loudly Parliament grumbled. The king had made his choice. And like many monarchs before him, he stood by that choice with stubborn loyalty. When James died in 1625, Buckingham didn't fall. Far from it. He transferred his influence directly onto the next king, Charles I, who had been his travelling companion and co-conspirator. But the tides were changing. The public, Parliament, and increasingly even the military, had run out of patience. In 1628, George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, was stabbed to death by a disgruntled naval officer named John Felton. The assassin claimed he was doing it for England, for the people. When the news reached London, bells rang in celebration. Crowds reportedly rejoiced in the streets. The favourite was dead, and with him, a chapter of royal excess that had come to symbolise everything wrong with the Stuarts. But James I's reign didn't just launch scandal, it also set the tone for what came next. A monarchy increasingly out of step with its people, a court driven by favouritism, and a royal family perpetually tangled in rumours of inappropriate intimacy. The relationship between king and favourite had always been fraught, but now it was fatal. And as the Stuarts continued to bumble their way through history, the crown eventually landed on a man who brought back the monarchy along with mistresses, debauchery, and an entire restoration court that made moralists weep. Charles II's Hedonistic Court, 1662nd, 1682nd. When Charles II returned to England in 1660 after more than a decade of exile, he did not arrive as a chastened man. He arrived as a king reborn. England had chopped off his father's head, flirted with Puritanism, and spent years trying to pretend it didn't miss its monarchy. But by the time the Cromwells had come and gone, the people were ready to dance again, and Charles, ever the pragmatist, gave them the most lavish masquerade they could imagine. The restoration wasn't just a political restoration, it was a moral reversal. Out went the black-clad austerity of the Puritan regime. In came silks, theatre, wine, and whispered scandal. Charles had spent his exile in the pleasure courts of France and the Netherlands, and he brought back with him all the courtly vices those nations had to offer. He wasn't shy about it. In fact, he embraced the reputation. "I am the king," he famously quipped, "and I will be obeyed." He was also frequently distracted. Mistresses weren't just tolerated, they were expected. Barbara Villiers, the tempestuous and ambitious mistress known as Lady Castlemaine, was installed in the royal household and bore the king several children. She was given titles, palaces, influence. When she wasn't in favour, someone else was Nell Gwynn, the saucy actress with a sharp tongue, Louise de Querouaille, the French Catholic spy with a penchant for jewels, Moll Davis, the dancer with a knack for extravagance. Each played their part in the royal theatre, with Charles as the smiling, ageing lead. It wasn't just personal, it was political. Mistresses were used to broker alliances, influence court appointments, and control access to the king. And while Parliament grumbled and the Church winced, Charles knew how to balance it all. He gave just enough power to his ministers, just enough patronage to his enemies, and just enough theatre to the people to keep the whole thing from collapsing. But behind the laughter and lace, trouble brewed. The crown's finances were in ruins. Religious tensions simmered, especially with Charles's open sympathy for Catholics and his brother James, Duke of York, an avowed Catholic himself. The court's reputation for indulgence made the monarchy look unserious, even fragile. When the Great Plague struck in 1665 and the Great Fire followed in 1666, some began to wonder if the revelry had gone too far. Divine judgment, they whispered. Too much sin, too little statecraft. And yet Charles endured. His charm was his greatest weapon. Even those who despised his policies found themselves entertained by the man. He played the public like a lute smiling, quipping, avoiding war, and reminding everyone that after the cold grip of Cromwellian rule, it was at least more fun to be ruled by a man who preferred champagne to sermons. He sired at least a dozen illegitimate children, all acknowledged, many given titles. Not one, of course, was legitimate. His wife, Catherine of Braganza, remained childless, a personal tragedy that cast a long shadow over the succession. But Charles refused to name any of his mistress's children as heir. For all his looseness in love, he remained oddly conservative in politics. The monarchy, he understood, had limits even if his personal appetites did not. When he died in 1685, his last words were perfectly on brand. "Let not poor Nelly starve," referring of course to Nell Gwynn, who had amused the king for years. It was a moment of unexpected sentimentality from a man who had spent his reign surrounded by jesters, poets, and politicians, often indistinguishable from each other. Charles II's court didn't just scandalize it, redefined what scandal meant. It wasn't hidden, it wasn't whispered, it was the wallpaper of public life. The restoration wasn't a return to order, it was a performance. One that the English people applauded, even as they quietly wondered what act might follow. And they would find out soon enough, because just a few years later, a birth would rock the monarchy. A birth so politically inconvenient, so suspicious, and so hotly contested, it would require a warming pan to explain. The warming pan baby, 1688. When Queen Mary of Modena gave birth to a healthy baby boy on the 10th of June, 1688, the event should have been a triumph. Her husband, King James II of England, had longed for a Catholic male heir. For years, he had endured the whispers and the political pressure surrounding his lack of a son. And then, finally, one arrived. James Francis Edward Stuart. A prince, a future king, a dynastic victory, or so it would seem. Almost immediately, the joyous birth was consumed by the kind of paranoid theatre only 17th century England could produce. Within days, rumours began to swirl that the newborn prince was not, in fact, born of the Queen's body at all. That instead, he had been smuggled into her bedchamber in a warming pan, a copper pot used to heat bedsheets. The story went that a stillborn baby had been quietly removed and replaced with a living child, introduced under the guise of warming the royal linens. To modern ears, it sounds absurd, but in the context of the time deeply Protestant, deeply suspicious, and deeply fearful of a renewed Catholic dynasty, it sounded plausible enough to spark a crisis. The idea of a warming pan baby wasn't just a bizarre conspiracy theory, it was a political hand grenade. The English elites, particularly the Whigs, had long tolerated James II's Catholicism on the condition that his Protestant daughters, Mary and Anne, would eventually succeed him. A Catholic male heir upended that arrangement. And with Mary already married to William of Orange, a Protestant Dutch prince, and a Protestant English hope, the birth of a Catholic heir suddenly felt like the beginning of a dynastic trap. The accusations were vicious and specific. Witnesses claimed the Queen's labour had been faked, that the women in the room had concealed the swap, that James's Jesuit advisors orchestrated the entire scheme. The warming pan theory spread so widely that dozens of affidavits were collected. Elizabeth witnesses were summoned. Even midwives were interrogated. The court tried to refute the claims with official reports and eyewitness testimony. It didn't work. Because, at its core, the issue wasn't evidence, it was trust, or lack thereof. James had alienated much of the political class with his aggressive pro-Catholic policies. He had bypassed Parliament, placed Catholics in positions of power, and dissolved local charters. Many feared he aimed to re-Catholicize England by force. The baby, real or not, became a symbol of that fear. A flesh and blood embodiment of a future many in England had no intention of allowing. By November 1688, William of Orange landed in England with a small army invited by several English nobles in what became known as the Glorious Revolution. James fled. The baby, still officially the prince, was quietly taken abroad. Parliament declared that the throne had been vacated. William and Mary were invited to rule jointly. James Francis Edward Stuart would spend the rest of his life in exile, styled as the Old Pretender. His birth, whether miraculous or manipulated, never quite escaped its warming pan origins. Decades later, he would try to reclaim the throne during the Jacobite uprisings. He failed. But the myth of his smuggled birth never entirely died. In truth, it probably wasn't a hoax. Most modern historians agree that Mary gave birth naturally. But history isn't shaped solely by facts, it's shaped by what people are willing to believe. And in 1688, England was ready to believe almost anything to avoid a Catholic dynasty. Thus, the warming pan baby became one of the strangest, most potent royal scandals. A story about a story where truth was buried beneath fear, and a copper pan became more powerful than a crown. And the royal family, forever shadowed by that suspicion, continued its long dance with scandal. Because the next monarch would prove that you could exile kings. You could rewrite succession, but you couldn't legislate away. Betrayal in marriage. George I and Sophia Dorothea. When George I arrived from Hanover to become King of Great Britain in 1714, he brought with him a reign defined by awkward silences, linguistic confusion, and most tragically, a wife who never made it out of Germany. Her name was Sophia Dorothea of Celle. Once a princess, then a prisoner, and always an inconvenient memory. Their marriage had been arranged decades earlier, not out of love or compatibility, but necessity. George needed a legitimate heir. Sophia Dorothea came with the right bloodlines and a tolerable dowry. That was enough. The union was as cold as the northern winters of Hanover. The couple barely spoke. They shared little affection. And when they did engage, it was often in the form of public arguments that even courtiers found uncomfortable to witness. Still, the marriage produced 2 children, most notably George Augustus, later George II. Duty, after all, was more binding than love. But over time, Sophia Dorothea grew tired of the farce. And then, in the late 1692, she did something unthinkable for a royal wife. She formed a close attachment with another man. His name was Count Philip Christoph von Königsmarck. He was handsome, daring, a Swedish noble with a flair for intrigue. He and Sophia Dorothea exchanged letters, hundreds of them. Their relationship may have been romantic, possibly even a planned escape. Either way, it was an open secret by 1694. Then, Königsmarck vanished. He had reportedly been summoned to the palace for a late-night meeting. He never walked out. Rumors of his death began immediately murdered, some said, by guards loyal to George. Others claimed his body was dumped into the River Line. No investigation was ever opened. The message was clear. Discretion is not optional. As for Sophia Dorothea, she was placed under house arrest in the castle of Alden, not just for a week or a year, but for the rest of her life. 30 years of confinement, no court appearances, no visitors without permission, no reunion with her children who were raised to view her as a disgraced traitor. Officially, she was divorced. Unofficially, she was erased. George, meanwhile, carried on with his life. When he became King of Britain in 1714 after Queen Anne's death, he arrived with a German-speaking court and left his former wife locked away back in Celle. He never mentioned her in public. She died in 1726, still imprisoned, still ignored. When word of her death reached George, he reportedly showed no reaction. And yet the stain remained. George's treatment of his wife, and the suspicious disappearance of Königsmarck, became a ghost story whispered across Europe's royal courts. Not because it was unique, but because it was so perfectly symbolic. A king with no heart, a wife with no voice, and a kingdom forced to pretend it was normal. Even the British public, who barely knew who she was, sensed the unease. It wasn't just that a queen had been locked away, it was that the monarchy seemed so casual about it. As if marital betrayal and political convenience were just part of the job description. And if that message had any doubt, it would be confirmed again. Because in the years that followed, the British royal family would go from secret lovers to secret weddings, and Parliament would finally step in to say, enough. Secret royal marriages sparked the Royal Marriages Act, 1772. In the 18th century, royal weddings weren't really about love. They were about politics, power and pedigree. Love could be a pleasant side effect, of course, but no one in the Hanoverian dynasty was under the illusion that emotion came before duty. And yet, by the time King George III pushed the Royal Marriages Act through Parliament in 1772, the message was clear. If the royal family couldn't behave itself romantically, Parliament would do it for them. The scandal began not with one marriage, but with several. The House of Hanover had a growing problem. Younger royals were marrying whomever they pleased, with little regard for protocol or legality. It all came to a head with Prince Henry, Duke of Cumberland and Strathyarn George III's younger brother and an unrepentant scandal magnate. In 1771, he secretly married Anne Horton, a commoner and even more scandalously, a widow. Worse still, she was perceived as socially inferior and rumoured to be of questionable reputation. The royal family was appalled. George III, a monarch who prided himself on moral rectitude and domestic stability, was humiliated. And this wasn't an isolated incident. Just a few years earlier, another of George's brothers, Prince William Henry, Duke of Gloucester and Edinburgh, had also married in secret this time to Maria Walpole, the illegitimate granddaughter of Britain's first Prime Minister. Again, no royal consent had been sought. Again, scandal followed. For George III, who had spent his reign trying to present the monarchy as a beacon of respectability, these rogue marriages were not just personal affronts, they were constitutional crises. Royal marriages had implications for succession, international diplomacy, and the moral example of the crown. If anyone with a title could marry anyone with a pulse, what was the point of having a monarchy at all? And so, George acted. The Royal Marriages Act of 1772 declared that any descendant of King George II, excluding those married to foreign royalty, must obtain the reigning monarch's consent before marrying. Without that consent, any such marriage would be legally void. For those over the age of 25, a loophole was allowed. They could marry after a year's notice to the Privy Council, provided Parliament didn't object. In theory, it was a legal measure. In practice, it was a royal leash. The public reaction was mixed. Some saw it as necessary an effort to preserve the dignity of the crown. Others saw it as oppressive, an outdated assertion of monarchical control over adult lives. And the royal family? They grumbled quietly and married discreetly. What the act didn't do, of course, was stop scandal. It merely rerouted it. Over the next century and beyond, royal romances would continue to raise eyebrows, stretch rules, and occasionally break them. The Royal Marriages Act would remain on the books until 2015, an astonishingly long shelf life for a piece of legislation inspired by one ill-advised match and the wounded pride of a king. But if George III thought the act would keep future royal hearts in check, he didn't have to look far to see it fail. Because his own son George IV would go on to commit a matrimonial offence so bold, so technically illegal, it would make his uncle's union look practically bureaucratic. George IV's illegal secret marriage to Maria Fitzherbert, 1785. George IV back then, still just the rakish Prince of Wales, wasn't what you'd call a rule follower. He was theatrical, impulsive, perpetually in debt, and always looking for the next scandal. So it shouldn't have come as a surprise when, in 1785, he did something that wasn't just politically reckless, but also technically illegal. He married a Catholic widow in secret. Her name was Maria Fitzherbert. Twice widowed, devoutly Catholic, and more emotionally stable than anyone George had ever pursued, she was an unlikely object of obsession for the heir to the throne. They met in 1784, and George fell hard. Letters flew, proposals were made. She refused him repeatedly, not because she didn't care for him, but because she understood exactly what it meant to marry the Prince of Wales. For one thing, under the Royal Marriages Act passed just 13 years earlier, George needed his father's permission to marry. He knew full well he would never get it. Maria was a Catholic, and marrying her would be a direct violation of both the Act and the Act of Settlement, 1701, which barred Catholics from marrying into the royal line. Even the idea of it was political dynamite. Still, George persisted. Desperate, melodramatic, and armed with the emotional logic of a man raised to believe rules didn't apply to him, he threatened to take his own life if she refused. Eventually wearied by love, fear, and perhaps some hope, Maria relented. On the 15th of December, 1785, they were married in a secret ceremony conducted by a dissident clergyman. The marriage was invalid under English law, but not, perhaps, in the eyes of God, or more cynically, in the eyes of gossip. Legally, it meant nothing, but emotionally and symbolically, it meant everything. George treated Maria as his wife, in private if not in public. He lavished her with gifts, wrote her passionate letters, and considered her his true partner. But they could never appear together officially. The court knew, Parliament knew, the king knew, and no one dared speak it aloud. Maria, for her part, lived in a strange limbo. She was too important to ignore, too dangerous to acknowledge. She held influence, but no status. Security, but no title. When George eventually married Caroline of Brunswick in 1795, this time with royal and political sanction, it was not for love but necessity. Parliament had agreed to pay off George's massive debts if he agreed to a respectable marriage. He did, begrudgingly. Maria was devastated. The marriage to Caroline was a disaster. George hated her on sight, and she found him insufferable. They separated within a year, but it didn't matter. The legal marriage stood. Maria remained in the shadows. Still, she and George maintained a complicated, erratic relationship for years afterward. At times, they reconciled. At others, they broke ties. When George became king in 1820, Maria received a pension, but no recognition. She kept a box of love letters from him and claimed they were married in the eyes of heaven, if not the state. When she died in 1837, she was buried with a miniature portrait of George around her neck. Her private chapel held tokens of their life together, mementos from a union that history couldn't quite classify. Their marriage illegal, secret, and emotionally binding was the clearest proof yet that the Royal Marriages Act could control ceremony, but not sentiment. George may have worn a crown, but his heart was, as ever, entirely unsupervised. And as the next scandal would prove, even public ceremony couldn't contain the chaos when marriage turned from romance into battlefield, especially when one queen refused to go quietly. The Queen Caroline affair, 1820. If George IV thought he could ghost his wife and the country would simply move on, he underestimated two things: public opinion and Caroline of Brunswick. Their marriage, already infamous for mutual loathing, became one of the most spectacular royal train wrecks in British history. It was less a marriage and more a Cold War in pearls and powdered wigs, waged across continents, courthouses, and newspaper headlines. George IV, then Prince of Wales, had reluctantly married Caroline in 1795 to satisfy Parliament and secure financial relief. He had debts stacked like dominoes and no political leverage without a wife. Caroline, a German princess, was considered politically suitable but personally unsuitable from the moment they met. George reportedly demanded brandy after their first encounter. She, in turn, said he was fat and boring. Chemistry? Non-existent. They produced a daughter, Princess Charlotte, then promptly separated. Caroline was given a pension and politely asked to vanish. And vanish she did. Sort of. For most of the next 2 decades, she lived abroad, gallivanting around Europe, stirring rumours and raising eyebrows. Her behaviour was often eccentric and sometimes scandalous. She surrounded herself with a peculiar retinue of servants and companions, including one Bartolomeo Pergami, her Italian courier turned confidant. British spies reported improprieties, letters were intercepted. Rumours of an affair made their way back to London, where George, now king, waited for his chance to strike. That chance came in 1820. George IV ascended the throne after the death of his father, George III. Rather than reconciling with his estranged queen, he attempted the opposite, remove her entirely. But divorce wasn't simple, especially for royals. It required an Act of Parliament. So, George's government introduced the Pains and Penalties Bill, a clunky title for a legal sledgehammer that accused Caroline of adultery and sought to strip her of her title and rights. The public, however, was having none of it. Caroline, smelling opportunity, returned to England in triumph. She arrived to cheering crowds. Women tossed flowers at her carriage. Working-class Londoners, already suspicious of George's excesses and flamboyant lifestyle, took to her as a symbol of resistance. She was imperfect, yes, but she wasn't George, and that was enough. The House of Lords began a surreal and highly public trial in 1820. Witnesses were brought in to describe Caroline's supposed improprieties. Testimonies included tales of her sharing meals with servants, appearing in immodest dress, and behaving with shocking if vague familiarity toward Pergami. Much of it relied on innuendo. Some was clearly fabricated. The trial quickly devolved into a spectacle. Satirists and pamphleteers had a field day. Cartoons depicted George as bloated and gluttonous. Caroline became a folk hero, part martyr, part clown. The courtroom became a circus. The monarchy an awkward ringmaster trying to keep control of a performance no one respected. In the end, the government dropped the bill. They didn't have the votes, and the backlash was too severe. Caroline was not divorced, not stripped of her title, and not removed from public life. But the story doesn't end there. George, humiliated and vindictive, refused to allow Caroline to attend his coronation in 1821. On the day of the ceremony, she tried to enter Westminster Abbey and was denied repeatedly. At one point, she banged on the door, demanding entrance. The guards refused. The crowd murmured. She left in tears. A few weeks later, she fell ill. By August, she was dead. Her funeral was escorted through London by mourners who shouted, "The Queen! The Queen!" as soldiers tried to reroute the procession. There were skirmishes. The public mourned her not just as a queen denied dignity, but as a symbol of a monarchy increasingly at war with itself. And in the wake of that scandal, another relationship would rise to the surface, quieter, stranger, and equally controversial. One that involved the same queen, but a different kind of intimacy. A Highland servant, a grieving widow, and a friendship that would scandalize an empire. Victoria and John Brown, 1862, 1882. Queen Victoria wore black for 40 years. When her beloved husband, Prince Albert, died in 1861, she withdrew from public life with a grief so consuming it became a national crisis. Parliament begged her to reappear. Newspapers questioned her absence, but Victoria stayed cloistered, dressed in mourning, hidden from the world and, it seemed, from herself. And then came John Brown. A Scottish servant from Balmoral Brown had been one of Prince Albert's trusted grooms. After Albert's death, Victoria leaned on Brown for practical help, emotional support, and most controversially, companionship. What began as a professional assignment evolved into an intimate and deeply loyal bond. Brown was brusque, plain-spoken and unschooled in court etiquette, which, of course, made him both refreshing and dangerous. He called the Queen woman to her face. He addressed her as woman in letters. He reportedly carried a pistol to protect her and slept in a room next to hers. His familiarity with the Queen raised eyebrows almost immediately. Courtiers referred to him as the Queen's Stallion. Satirical cartoons lampooned their relationship. Members of the royal family were, at best, uncomfortable, at worst, outraged. Was it romantic? Historians still debate it. There's no definitive proof of a physical relationship, though their closeness, their private correspondence, and the Queen's visible emotional dependence suggest something beyond the ordinary. Victoria once described Brown as the only friend I can trust. In another note, she referred to him as my dear, good Brown. At a time when monarchs were expected to live above ordinary human emotion, Victoria had committed the greatest taboo of all. She had let someone see her grief. Brown, for his part, seemed completely unfazed by royal protocol. He insulted politicians, barked orders at staff, and took liberties that others would have been exiled for. But Victoria protected him. He was given medals, promotions, and a level of access that infuriated her advisors. In one incident, when an equerry refused to carry out an order from Brown, Victoria overruled him, siding with the servant against the establishment. What troubled people wasn't just the possibility of romance, it was the erosion of distance. The monarchy had always survived on mystique. Brown shattered that illusion. He was real. He was human. And, in many ways, he treated the Queen as human too. When Brown died in 1883, Victoria was devastated. She commissioned a statue of him, displayed in Windsor. She kept a lock of his hair. She wore a ring he had given her. And in a particularly controversial detail, a memorial plaque in his honour was installed in a private garden with the inscription, "Friend more than servant, loyal more than subject." When Victoria died in 1901, her doctor noted that she was buried with Brown's photograph, a ring, and a piece of his hair. That detail was quietly removed from the official records by her son Edward VII, who loathed Brown and wanted the relationship buried figuratively and literally. In the end, the story of Victoria and John Brown remains one of history's most enigmatic royal scandals, not because it was salacious, but because it was emotional. A queen who ruled an empire, leaning not on generals or lords, but on a gruff Scottish servant with wind-chapped hands and no patience for flattery. And yet, just a few years later, she would do it again, this time not with a Highland groom, but with an Indian clerk. A relationship that would provoke even deeper scandal and leave the empire clutching its pearls with imperial indignation. Victoria and Abdul Karim, 1887–1901. By the time Abdul Karim arrived at Queen Victoria's court in 1887, she had already worn her widow's black for over 25 years, outlived half her family, and buried her closest confidant, John Brown. She was 68, tired, and surrounded by courtiers who all acted like they were managing a fragile relic of the British Empire. What she wanted, it seemed, was not deference, but connection. And that's exactly what she found in a tall, confident Indian clerk with perfect penmanship and no idea what storm he was walking into. Abdul Karim was supposed to be a temporary footnote, a gift from the Indian Raj to serve at the Queen's Golden Jubilee, a symbolic gesture, a token of imperial gratitude. He was 24 years old, a Muslim from Agra, and was initially assigned the unimpressive task of serving desserts, but almost immediately he caught the Queen's attention. His manner was dignified, his presence calming, and most importantly, he treated her like a person, not a porcelain sovereign. Within weeks, he was promoted, first as a waiter, then as a personal clerk. Within months, he was teaching her Hindustani and Urdu, offering daily lessons in language and, increasingly, culture. She called him the Munshi, teacher. He called her Missy. Soon he was writing her letters, managing her correspondence, and advising her on Indian affairs with a closeness that stunned and unnerved everyone around her. The court was horrified. They had barely tolerated John Brown, at least he was British. But Karim? He was foreign, young, Muslim, and from a colony that was viewed more as a resource than a contributor to royal life. The racial and class boundaries of the empire were never supposed to extend into the Queen's drawing room. And yet, there he was, seated beside her, walking in her private gardens, granted access to her personal chambers, and awarded medals and titles that senior aristocrats waited decades to earn. The backlash was vicious and constant. Senior courtiers accused Karim of manipulating the Queen. They searched his quarters, intercepted his mail, and pressured her to dismiss him. The royal household, normally trained to camouflage disapproval behind courtly smiles, mutinied in polite slow motion. Even the Prince of Wales, future Edward VII, became involved, plotting ways to undermine Karim's influence without causing a public scene. But Victoria held her ground. She insisted on his dignity, defended his position, and refused to entertain any accusations of impropriety. Her letters to him were affectionate, personal, and pointedly protective. At one point, she wrote, "No one ever has, or ever can, take the place of my dear Brown. But you are so good and gentle that I feel I can always rely on you." This wasn't about scandal in the romantic sense, it was about scandal in the imperial sense. Karim's presence blurred every line the empire was built upon, between ruler and ruled, race and class, east and west. In the eyes of the establishment, it was an affront to the very order they existed to maintain. When Victoria's health began to decline in 1900, the knives sharpened. Plans were made, letters were drafted. The moment she died, they moved swiftly. On the morning of her death in January 1901, Abdul Karim was evicted from royal property. His letters from the Queen were seized and destroyed, his records scrubbed. He returned to India in disgrace, and within a few years, he too was dead. For decades, his story remained hidden. It wasn't until the 21st century that historians unearthed the letters, journals, and photographs that revealed just how deep the bond had been and just how determined the establishment had been to erase it. In the end, Karim became another of Victoria's forbidden intimacies, a reminder that even the most powerful woman in the world was constantly surrounded by men trying to tell her who she could trust. And her refusal to listen to them, again and again, was perhaps her most rebellious act. But scandal, once unleashed, tends not to die quietly, and in the decades that followed, the royal family found itself entangled in new kinds of controversies, less imperial, more personal. Starting with a court case so salacious, it forced the future king to deny under oath that he had ever been romantically involved with another man's wife. The Mordaunt divorce case, 1869. The Mordaunt divorce scandal exploded in 1869 like a well-mannered bombshell layered in propriety, dressed in satin, and carrying accusations that threatened to expose the unspoken truth about England's most eligible bachelor, the Prince of Wales. Sir Charles Mordaunt, a Conservative MP and country squire, had married Harriet Moncrieff, a renowned society beauty, in 1866. On paper, they were the ideal Victorian couple, titled attractive and dutiful. But behind the painted smiles and hunting parties, their marriage was anything but harmonious. Harriet was vibrant, flirtatious, and rumoured to be both indiscreet and deeply bored. Charles, by contrast, was conservative, jealous, and most inconveniently for a husband obsessed with propriety. By 1868, Harriet had given birth to a daughter, but questions quickly arose about the child's paternity. Charles, deeply suspicious, began investigating and found, to his apparent horror, that his wife's social life had included more than just tea and needlework. The list of alleged lovers included several prominent men, but one name stood out above all: Albert Edward, the Prince of Wales. That alone would have been enough to set the tabloids alight. But what followed was a public court case brought by Mordaunt himself to divorce his wife on the grounds of adultery, citing not just ordinary liaisons, but royal ones. This forced an unprecedented moment in British legal history. The future king was called as a witness in a scandal involving potential illegitimacy, betrayal, and bedroom escapades. It was the first, and still rare, instance where a direct heir to the throne had to appear in court and answer under oath. Albert Edward, to his credit or calculation, handled it with practiced calm. He admitted to visiting the Mordaunt home, yes. He had exchanged letters with Harriet, certainly. But had he ever been romantically involved? Absolutely not. His testimony was cool, clipped, and carefully devoid of confession. The press, predictably, exploded. The scandal had all the ingredients of Victorian drama: a fallen woman, a vengeful husband, a royal who may or may not have knocked before entering, and a courtroom full of reporters. But the verdict was murky. The court, unable to get a clean confession or sufficient proof, denied Mordaunt's divorce request. In a bizarre twist, the focus shifted from adultery to mental health. Harriet was declared insane and confined to an asylum. It was a tidy solution for a messy problem. She couldn't testify, and her institutionalization preserved what little dignity remained for everyone involved except, perhaps, herself. As for the Prince of Wales, his reputation took a bruising but ultimately survived. In a society where male indiscretions were often seen as inevitable, almost charming, his role in the scandal became more of a whispered anecdote than a lasting indictment. Still, the Mordaunt case cast a long shadow. It revealed just how vulnerable the royal family could be to legal scrutiny, public gossip, and the unpredictable entanglements of the aristocracy. It showed that even behind the veil of Victorian morality, everyone had something to hide. And the royal appetite for risk didn't end there, because only a few years later, the same prince would find himself at the centre of yet another scandal, this time not in a bedroom, but at a baccarat table, where the stakes were money, reputation, and the quiet expectation that royalty never cheats. The Tranby Croft Baccarat Affair, 1891. It began, as many royal scandals do, in the sort of setting where scandal thrives: a country house, a parlour game, and far too much champagne. Tranby Croft was a stately home in Yorkshire, owned by Arthur Wilson, a wealthy shipping magnate looking to impress. Among the guests in the summer of 1890 was none other than Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, known to his friends as Bertie and to his country as the future Edward VII. He was a man addicted to comfort, cigars, good food, and discreet chaos. The entertainment of choice that night was baccarat, a card game technically illegal in Britain, but commonly played in upper-class circles where law was often considered more of a suggestion. Bertie loved the game. He had a reputation for being a competent, if not especially lucky player. That night, he took his seat at the table alongside high society's gilded regulars, including Lieutenant Colonel Sir William Gordon Cumming, a dashing army officer known for his charm, his moustache, and by the end of the night, allegedly cheating. Several other guests at the table claimed to have witnessed Gordon Cumming manipulating his bets, discreetly increasing his stake after seeing the outcome of a hand. Rather than confront him publicly, A private meeting was arranged. The result, a written confession, signed under pressure, in exchange for everyone's silence. Case closed? Not quite. The affair might have remained a murky footnote in aristocratic circles, but in 1891, word leaked to the press. Gordon Cumming, incensed and now professionally ruined, sued for libel. And that's when things escalated into a full-blown public spectacle because the Prince of Wales, who had witnessed the events and signed the hush letter agreement, would now be called to testify again. For the second time in his life, Bertie found himself in a courtroom, forced to answer uncomfortable questions in front of a fascinated and increasingly cynical public. He took the stand at the High Court in June 1891. The press flooded the courtroom. Society held its breath. A future monarch was being asked, quite literally, to describe what happened at a late-night gambling session among the elite. Bertie's testimony was measured and minimal. He admitted to playing. He admitted to being part of the meeting where Gordon Cumming was confronted. But he maintained a careful neutrality, insisting he had not personally witnessed the cheating. It was a performance of royal detachment, polished, slightly condescending, and clearly calculated to protect the institution, if not the accused. The trial gripped the nation. The upper classes were scandalized not just by the cheating, but by the exposure. The public, on the other hand, was riveted. Here was the very embodiment of Victorian leisure aristocrats, cigars, gambling, whispered accusations being paraded in court like petty commoners. In the end, the jury ruled in favor of the defendants. Gordon Cumming lost. His reputation was destroyed. He was forced to retire from the military, but in many ways he won a moral victory. The public began to ask why the prince, a man of constant indulgence, was never held accountable for the company he kept or the rules he ignored. The monarchy, meanwhile, took a reputational hit. Bertie's role in the affair painted him not just as a pleasure-seeking aristocrat, but as a man whose presence had become a liability. The case confirmed what many already suspected, that the royal court, far from being the moral compass of the nation, was just another club for wealthy men to misbehave in. Years later, when Bertie finally ascended the throne as Edward VII in 1901, he had polished his image just enough to survive. But the baccarat scandal lingered in the background, a reminder that even the most frivolous evening can turn into a constitutional mess when royalty is at the table. And just when the monarchy thought it had survived its last public scandal of the Victorian era, history dealt a more brutal hand. A king who would trade his crown for love, and in doing so, throw the entire British establishment into an existential tailspin. The Abdication Crisis, 1936. When King Edward VIII took the throne in January 1936, Britain expected a modern monarch handsome, charismatic, and worldly. What it got instead was a constitutional thunderstorm, disguised as a love story. Edward, known to his inner circle as David, had never fit the mould of his royal role. As Prince of Wales, he had travelled the empire with flair, admired for his looks but criticised for his indifference to duty. He was restless, impulsive, and allergic to paperwork. Still, the monarchy hoped that once the crown settled on his head, he'd grow into the role. They were wrong. The centre of the storm was Wallace Simpson, a twice-divorced American socialite with a sharp tongue, impeccable style, and a knack for navigating upper-class dysfunction. She and Edward had met in the early 1932nd, and by 1934 they were inseparable. Edward was obsessed. Letters flew. Dinners became disappearances. Official functions were skipped. and by the time his father George V died in 1936, the new king was already deep into what the press euphemistically called an unsuitable attachment. There was one small problem. The King of England could not marry a twice-divorced woman with 2 living ex-husbands, not if he expected to remain on the throne. The Church of England, of which Edward was now the supreme governor, strictly forbade such a union. So did the British government. The Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, made it clear Wallace was not compatible with the crown. What followed was a standoff unlike any other in British history. Edward insisted on marrying Wallace. The government insisted he could not. Compromise attempts were floated, a morganatic marriage in which Wallace wouldn't become queen but the political and religious establishment wouldn't bend. For them, the issue wasn't just marriage. It was monarchy itself. A king who defied the rules to marry for love threatened the entire machinery of constitutional monarchy. The British press, largely compliant with the government's wishes, remained silent. But the foreign media, especially in America, covered the romance obsessively. British subjects who read international newspapers knew more than their own neighbours. By December, the dam broke. On the 10th of December, 1936, Edward signed an instrument of abdication, making his younger brother, Albert, soon to be George VI, the new king. The next night, Edward gave a radio address to the nation. In a voice tinged with emotion, he said, "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman I love." It was romantic, it was dramatic, and it was, politically speaking, an earthquake. Edward became the Duke of Windsor. He married Wallace in France 6 months later. No member of the royal family attended. For the rest of his life, he remained in semi-exile, occasionally returning to Britain but never regaining trust or purpose. His wife was never welcomed by the family. They became tabloid figures, elegant, aimless, forever outside the palace gates. The Abdication Crisis changed everything. It reshaped the line of succession, placed an unprepared George VI on the throne during the most turbulent era in modern history, and eventually ushered in the reign of Elizabeth II. It also marked the last time a British monarch tried to bend the system to personal will, and lost. For some, Edward's story was one of tragic romance. For others, it was a betrayal of duty. But one thing was certain. The monarchy had barely survived the storm, and in the decades to follow, its walls would be tested again, this time not by love, but by espionage. Because even within the trusted inner circle of the crown, not all loyalties were what they seemed. Anthony Blunt, exposed as a Soviet spy, 1979. When the news broke in 1979 that Anthony Blunt, distinguished art historian, royal insider, and decorated war hero, had spent years as a Soviet spy, the reaction was somewhere between disbelief and national betrayal. It was as if the Queen's own wallpaper had started whispering secrets to Moscow, and in a way, it had. Blunt wasn't just anyone. He was a respected academic, the surveyor of the King's, later the Queen's pictures, and had direct access to the royal collection, as well as access social and otherwise to the corridors of Buckingham Palace. Educated at Cambridge, charming, erudite, impeccably mannered, and thoroughly woven into Britain's elite, he looked like the last person you'd suspect of treachery. Which, of course, made him perfect. But long before he was analysing the brushstrokes of Poussin or curating Renaissance treasures for the monarchy, Blunt had been part of something far darker, the infamous Cambridge spy ring. Alongside men like Guy Burgess, Kim Philby, and Donald Maclean, Blunt had been recruited in the 1932nd by Soviet intelligence. These weren't disgruntled radicals or desperate defectors. They were golden boys, members of the British establishment who believed in their early years that Marxism might actually save civilization from itself. During World War II, Blunt worked for MI5, where he had access to classified material, some of which he quietly passed along to his Soviet handlers. After the war, he transitioned back into academia and arts administration, eventually becoming the Queen's official art advisor. He received a knighthood in 1956. By all appearances, his double life was buried in the past. Until it wasn't. By the 1962nd, suspicions were growing. Other members of the Cambridge Ring had already defected or been exposed. Blunt's name began to surface quietly in intelligence circles. In 1964, under pressure, he confessed to MI5. The British government made a decision that now seems like something from a surreal spy novel. They gave him immunity in exchange for his cooperation and kept it all secret. He retained his royal appointment. The Queen was informed, discreetly, and the public was told nothing for 15 years. Then, in 1979, the dam broke. The newly elected Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, announced to Parliament that Blunt had been a Soviet spy. The revelation stunned the country. Here was a man who had walked the halls of the palace, stood beside the Queen, and curated the cultural legacy of the monarchy, now publicly branded a traitor. The backlash was immediate. Newspapers erupted. Television commentators recoiled. The Queen, famously composed, was said to be hurt and betrayed. Blunt was stripped of his knighthood. His reputation disintegrated overnight. Students walked out of his lectures. Friends abandoned him. Institutions distanced themselves. Blunt, for his part, expressed regret, but never offered a stirring apology. He insisted that his actions had been misguided idealism in youth, not malevolence. He faded into quiet disgrace, retreating from public life and dying in 1983, leaving behind a bitter taste and a legacy tangled in paradox. What made the Blunt affair especially unnerving was the proximity to power. This wasn't a case of some rogue agent in the shadows, it was a man with literal keys to the palace. His betrayal wasn't just of country or queen, it was of trust, image, and the belief that certain institutions were untouchable. It reminded the public that danger didn't always come wearing enemy uniforms. Sometimes it came wearing a tweed jacket and a polite smile, humming softly down the marbled corridors of Windsor. And after Blunt, the monarchy would never again be quite so comfortable with closeness. But if espionage had exposed the cracks in royal loyalty, the next scandal would expose something far more human and, in many ways, more relatable. Love. Forbidden, doomed, complicated love. The kind that tabloids adore. The kind that constitutional monarchy detests. The kind embodied, heartbreakingly, by a princess and a man in uniform. Princess Margaret and Peter Townsend, 1953-1955. Princess Margaret was everything the post-war monarchy didn't quite know how to handle: glamorous, rebellious, moody, and incandescent in a way that made courtiers anxious and the public entranced. She was the younger sister, the spare, the beautiful royal who never had to rule and therefore had time to glitter. But in the early 1952nd, Margaret stopped being a fashionable headline and became something more combustible, a constitutional problem with a beating heart. The issue was Peter Townsend. Group Captain Peter Townsend was a decorated RAF officer, equerry to King George VI, and a quiet, dashing presence at court. He had been married, had children, and was known for his integrity and restraint. When he and Margaret began to grow close, first in the shadow of her father's death, then in the early vulnerable days of her sister Elizabeth's reign, it was treated at first as a footnote. But that changed quickly. By 1953, Margaret and Townshend were in love. The problem? He was divorced. In today's world, such a relationship might raise eyebrows, but not alarms. In the Britain of the 1952nd, it was a royal crisis. The Church of England, of which Elizabeth II was supreme governor, did not permit remarriage after divorce if the ex-spouse was still living. For a senior royal to marry a divorcee was not only controversial, it was unthinkable. Sound familiar? It should. Less than 2 decades earlier, Edward VIII had abdicated the throne over his desire to marry Wallis Simpson, a twice-divorced American. That trauma was still fresh. The monarchy had rebuilt itself under George VI with an image of stability, sacrifice, and post-war stoicism. Margaret marrying Townshend would shatter that all over again. As speculation mounted, the court flailed. Townshend was quietly reassigned, shipped off to Brussels as air attaché, a not-so-subtle way of saying, "Please disappear." Margaret, for her part, was torn. She was in love, but she was also a royal. The weight of expectation, tradition, and her sister's crown pressed down like a velvet anvil. Then came the compromise. Under the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, Margaret, being over 25, could marry without the Queen's permission if she gave a year's notice and Parliament didn't object. But there was a catch. If she did so, she'd lose her title, her income, her place in the line of succession, and most painfully, her role within the family. In October 1955, after weeks of speculation, Margaret issued a public statement. She would not marry Townshend. "Mindful of the Church's teachings," she wrote, "I have decided to put duty before personal desire." The country sighed, some with relief, others with heartbreak. For years afterward, the narrative of Margaret and Townshend was treated as a romantic tragedy. He eventually remarried. She moved on, publicly at least, but something in her seemed dimmed. The sparkling, unpredictable princess became a symbol of sacrifice, not the noble, applauded kind, but the kind that gnaws at the edges of identity. The press never forgot. The story became a ghost that followed her into every subsequent relationship, including the one that eventually did lead to marriage and, scandalously, divorce. But that comes later. For now, Margaret's love story became the template for every royal romance to follow. Duty versus desire, institution versus individual. A blueprint of how the crown survives and who must suffer to keep it shining. And if that blueprint hadn't already cost enough, Margaret's next chapter would show just how fragile royal unions could be, even when the couple made it down the aisle. Princess Margaret's divorce, 1978. When Princess Margaret married Anthony Armstrong Jones in 1960, the palace tried very hard to sell it as a triumph. After all, the younger sister of Queen Elizabeth II, once heartbreakingly denied her first great love, was finally getting her fairy tale. A dashing commoner, a modern wedding, glamour by the bucket. Margaret in her Dior gown. The first royal wedding to be televised. It was, for a fleeting moment, the monarchy's answer to the swinging 60s. Cool, accessible, photogenic. But behind the pictures, the cracks began almost immediately. Anthony Armstrong Jones, later Lord Snowdon, was not a man built for royal protocol. He was a photographer by trade, a bohemian by instinct, and an outsider to the core. His world was one of artists, intellectuals, and fashion editors. Hers was one of tiaras, protocol officers, and constitutional obligation. At first, that contrast seemed to work. He gave Margaret an escape from the suffocating formality of palace life. She gave him access to one of the most exclusive clubs on earth. They had 2 children, attended gallery openings, and threw parties that blurred the line between aristocratic and avant-garde. Margaret smoked, drank, and held court like a fallen goddess in exile. Snowdon built a reputation as both an artist and a provocateur, but the marriage, built on contrasts, began to unravel under the weight of them. By the 1972nd, things had turned ugly. Margaret spent increasing time on the Caribbean island of Mustique, her private paradise far from the gaze of Fleet Street. There, she entertained friends, hosted elaborate beach parties, and found distraction in the form of younger companions, including the infamous Roddy Llewellyn, a landscape gardener 17 years her junior. The tabloids pounced. Photos of them lounging poolside surfaced. Margaret's toy boy became a national punchline. Snowdon, for his part, had his own string of affairs. The marriage had become not just emotionally empty, but logistically separate. They lived apart more often than together, connected more by titles than by affection. It was no longer a union, it was a truce. In 1976, the couple formally separated. 2 years later, in 1978, their divorce was finalized. It was the first royal divorce since the Restoration period in the 17th century. In a family that prided itself on projecting continuity and moral uprightness, this was not just a personal failure, it was a constitutional rupture. The monarchy had always relied on the illusion of harmony. Margaret's divorce shattered that illusion. It opened the door symbolically, if not legally, for other royal splits to follow. It also invited public scrutiny into royal marriages as never before. If a princess could fall out of love, be photographed with her lover, and divorce without exile, what did that mean for the sacred aura of the crown? In retrospect, Margaret's divorce became a kind of prelude, a warning bell for what would come in the next decades. The institution would face far more devastating marital collapses. But in 1978, this was unprecedented. A royal woman choosing to leave a marriage rather than preserve appearances? Unthinkable just a generation earlier. Margaret, ever the royal rebel, had done it again. And the monarchy, always one scandal behind the times, scrambled to adjust. Yet even as it tried to reframe her divorce as a private matter, the public had already tuned in hungry for more. Because the next royal revelations wouldn't come in the courtroom or the registry office. They would arrive, uninvited, through telephone wires, whispered in the dark, recorded, leaked, and plastered across the tabloids like a royal diary no one was meant to read. Squidgygate, 1992. By the early 1992nd, the House of Windsor was no longer an untouchable institution. It was a tabloid industry, a soap opera in crowns, and thanks to new technology, a microphone away from disaster. Enter Squidgygate. A scandal so strange, so intimate, and so intrusive, it made headlines not just for its content, but for what it revealed about the collapsing privacy of the royal family. The year was 1992. A voice recording surfaced in the British press. It featured a phone conversation, allegedly from late 1989, between Diana, Princess of Wales, and James Gilby, an old friend and occasional romantic companion. The tape captured them in a cozy, whispery exchange, filled with pet names, flirtations, and a kind of emotional vulnerability that royal protocol had no space for. Gilby repeatedly called her Squidgy, 20 times in fact, hence the nickname. On the tape, Diana expressed unhappiness, paranoia, and a desire to escape the pressures of royal life. She spoke of her sadness, her estrangement from Prince Charles, her fears of surveillance. It was a raw, human moment, a real woman, trapped in a gilded cage, reaching for comfort. And then it went public. The first publication was in The Sun, which gleefully splashed excerpts across its front page. Other papers followed. Soon, the entire country was reading what had once been a private moment between two people caught in a complex emotional web. There were questions about the legality of the recording. Was it a wiretap, a radio scanner? The origin was murky, but the impact was crystal clear. The monarchy was mortified. Buckingham Palace issued no comment. The Queen, reportedly appalled, remained silent. Diana didn't deny the call, but she also didn't explain it. The scandal hung in the air like a thundercloud. For many, it was confirmation of what had long been whispered, that Charles and Diana's marriage was over in everything but name, and that both parties were leading separate emotional lives. Just a few months earlier, another leaked call, this time between Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles, would drop a media bomb of its own. But Squidgygate came first, and it cracked the dam. What made the scandal so potent wasn't just the content, it was the intrusion. The idea that a princess, in her own home, could be recorded, scrutinized, dissected, and humiliated for the sake of headlines. It exposed the thin line between public service and personal destruction, between curiosity and cruelty. At the same time, public sympathy for Diana surged. Many saw her not as a rule breaker, but as a victim isolated, ignored, emotionally starved, and hunted by both the press and her own institution. She wasn't cold or aloof, she was hurting, and people related to that. Squidgygate wasn't the first royal phone scandal. It wouldn't be the last. But it signalled a change in how the monarchy was viewed. No longer above the fray, the royals were now media fodder, vulnerable, exposed, and one poorly timed call away from disaster. And if the nickname Squidgy raised eyebrows, the next leak would obliterate all pretense. Because when Charles and Camilla's private chat hit the airwaves, it wasn't flirtation, it was anatomy. And the public wasn't just listening, it was laughing, cringing, and, for a moment, wondering if monarchy itself had lost the plot. Camilla Gate, Tampon Gate, 1993. If Squidgygate felt like peeking through the royal keyhole, Camilla Gate was a full-on audio-assisted tumble into the bedroom, though bedroom might be generous. The year was 1993, and the British public was barely catching its breath from one leaked phone scandal before another arrived, more intimate, more explicit, and more irreversibly damaging to the image of the future king. The tape, originally recorded in 1989, but published in People, an Australian magazine, and then widely circulated in British tabloids, featured a late-night phone conversation between Prince Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles. It was supposed to be private, intimate, perhaps even mundane, if you weren't the heir to the throne. Instead, it became a cultural phenomenon, and not in a good way. The transcript was excruciating. The two lovers whispered back and forth, clearly besotted, in a way that left no ambiguity about the emotional, if not physical, depth of their relationship. And then came the line. Charles, attempting to express just how inseparable he felt from Camilla, joked half playfully, half creepily that he wanted to live inside her trousers, then speculated he might be reincarnated as a tampon. Yes, that was the moment. That was the soundbite. The future King of England, reduced to a punchline, a tampon on the front pages of nearly every paper in the English-speaking world. The fallout was immediate and merciless. Late-night comedians had a field day. Satirical radio programs aired dramatic readings of the transcript. Sales of feminine hygiene products reportedly spiked, purely for comedic purposes. Charles, long painted as the aloof, cerebral prince, suddenly became a figure of ridicule. Camilla, already disliked by much of the public for her perceived role in the breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage, was branded the most hated woman in Britain. But beyond the embarrassment was a deeper scandal. This confirmed, in real time, the affair that Buckingham Palace had long refused to acknowledge. Charles and Camilla had insisted for years that they were just friends, but here was hard evidence, whispered sweet nothings and all that the friendship had overstepped every conceivable boundary. And it couldn't have come at a worse time. Just a year earlier, 1992, what the Queen famously dubbed her annus horribilis had already delivered 3 royal separations, a fire at Windsor Castle, and the tell-all biography Diana, Her True Story, which depicted Charles as cold and unfaithful. The royal brand was under siege. Camillagate didn't just bruise it, it publicly eviscerated it. For Charles, the scandal set back any hope of public rehabilitation for years. His approval ratings plummeted. The idea of Camilla ever becoming queen was, at the time, almost laughable. The monarchy's defenders scrambled to paint the tape as an invasion of privacy, and it was, but the damage had been done. The public wasn't debating journalistic ethics. They were quoting tampon jokes. For Diana, the tape was validation, proof, broadcast across the world that her suspicions weren't paranoia. That her public role as the demure, dutiful wife had always been a cover for a personal tragedy playing out behind palace walls. And for Camilla, it was reputational annihilation. Her name, her voice, her private life, everything was now a matter of national discussion, often in terms dripping with misogyny and mockery. The royal family, never particularly warm toward her, retreated further. She was unofficial, untitled, and now undeniably infamous. Still, the institution endured, as it always does. But something fundamental had shifted. The monarchy was no longer a dignified abstraction. It was a source of gossip, a player in its own soap opera, as flawed and exposed as the rest of us, only with better tailoring and worse luck. And then, just when it seemed things couldn't possibly get worse, the Queen stepped forward, not to scold, not to apologize, but to admit very publicly that 1,992 had broken something, not just in the family, but in the very idea of monarchy itself. The Queen's Annus Horribilis, 1992. By the end of 1992, Queen Elizabeth II had been on the throne for 40 years. She had weathered wars, recessions, assassinations, and endless headlines. But nothing had prepared her for the relentless, humiliating chaos of that year. In a rare moment of emotional transparency, she described it publicly as her Annus Horribilis Latin for horrible year. It was as close to a royal scream as the world would ever hear. The phrase came during a speech at the Guildhall in London, marking the 40th anniversary of her accession. The Queen, usually so composed, stepped behind the podium and delivered a message not just of reflection, but of exhaustion. 1992, she said, is not a year on which I shall look back with undiluted pleasure. That, of course, was understatement in royal code, because the year had been an unmitigated catastrophe. First came the marital implosions. In March, Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson formally separated. Their relationship had been under strain for years, plagued by long-distance separation and tabloid intrusions. But it was about to get much worse. Just 5 months later, the Daily Mirror published photos of Sarah on holiday with American businessman John Bryan sucking her toes. Yes, the future Duchess of York was front-page news, barefoot and publicly entwined with a man not her husband. The Queen was reportedly furious. The photos, taken with a long lens, didn't just violate privacy, they annihilated dignity. Meanwhile, Princess Anne divorced her husband, Captain Mark Phillips, that same year. The Queen's only daughter, usually considered the no-nonsense one, was now officially part of the royal breakup pattern. That made 2 divorces and a separation in less than 12 months. And then, the Charles and Diana situation imploded further. Diana's unauthorized biography by Andrew Morton, published earlier in the year, had already exposed her struggles with depression, bulimia, and marital isolation. It painted Charles as cold and unfaithful, and hinted barely veiled at Camilla's ongoing presence. The book was initially presented as unauthorized. Later, it was revealed that Diana had secretly collaborated. The palace, already reeling from the scandal, now faced the reality that one of its own had actively participated in dismantling its mythos. As if that weren't enough, on the 20th of November, Windsor Castle caught fire. A spotlight technician accidentally ignited a curtain in Queen Victoria's private chapel. The fire spread rapidly. By the time it was extinguished 15 hours later, more than 100 rooms were destroyed or damaged. Priceless artworks were saved by a bucket brigade of staff, soldiers, and royals, including Prince Andrew himself, but the damage was immense. Then came the insult after the injury, a proposal that public funds be used for restoration. The British public, already sour on royal extravagance, erupted. Calls grew louder for the royals to pay taxes, which until then they had largely avoided. In response, the Queen agreed for the first time in modern history to begin paying income tax and opened Buckingham Palace to the public to raise funds. It was a moment of forced adaptation, not generosity. 1992 wasn't just a bad year, it was a reckoning. The monarchy, once buffered from modern pressures by tradition and mystique, was now a family in crisis, on full public display. The Queen, ever the figure of composure, had to address it not with royal decree, but with subtle, painful candour. And still, the worst wasn't over. Because even as the smoke cleared from Windsor and the marriages dissolved in the tabloids, another royal would take a risk. Not with marriage, not with scandalous letters, but with a television camera and a confessional so shocking that it would change the course of the monarchy forever. Diana's 1995 BBC Panorama interview. If the monarchy was already bruised by the time the Queen declared 1992 her annus horribilis, what followed 3 years later wasn't just a wound, it was a televised unravelling. On the 20th of November, 1995, millions of Britons tuned in to BBC's Panorama to watch a shy, isolated woman take on the most powerful institution in the country. The programme opened with a quiet graphic, an interview with HRH, the Princess of Wales. What followed was 55 minutes of seismic confessions, constitutional provocation, and quietly delivered fury. Diana wasn't speaking in riddles or abstractions. She spoke with calm clarity. She confirmed her husband's affair with Camilla Parker Bowles. She described feeling like an outsider in her own marriage. She discussed her struggles with bulimia, self-worth, and the constant pressure of public life. And in a line that instantly entered royal legend, she quipped, "Well, there were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded." The British public sat stunned. The palace, blindsided, scrambled for damage control. Diana hadn't sought approval for the interview. She hadn't informed the Queen. She had gone rogue, tactfully, calmly, devastatingly rogue, and perhaps most shockingly, the interview revealed that she did not see herself as part of the royal future. Asked if she wanted to be queen, she replied, "I'd like to be a queen of people's hearts. It was the moment the monarchy officially lost the PR war. But behind the scenes, the interview was built on deception. The journalist who secured the scoop, Martin Bashir, would later be revealed to have used forged bank documents to convince Diana's brother that palace staff were spying on her. The implication? That Diana was being betrayed from the inside, surveilled, manipulated. Bashir's pitch wasn't just journalistic, it was conspiratorial. And it worked. The deception didn't come to light for decades. At the time, the BBC basked in the glory of its exclusive, while Buckingham Palace reeled. Within a month of the interview, the Queen urged both Charles and Diana to divorce, finally and officially. They had been separated since 1992, but now the rift was too wide, too public, too radioactive to maintain any fiction of reconciliation. Diana's boldness created a global conversation about mental health, privacy, and the toxic intersection of fame and duty. She had reframed herself not as a victim, but as a survivor. Not a royal accessory, but a human being under siege. It was revolutionary and risky. She received praise for her courage, but also criticism for destabilizing the monarchy at a vulnerable moment. Still, the damage was done, and it wasn't limited to reputations. The institution itself had been punctured by a microphone and a single chair in a Kensington Palace drawing room. Years later, an inquiry led by former Judge Lord Dyson confirmed that Bashir had used deceitful methods to secure the interview. The BBC publicly apologised. William, Diana's eldest son, issued a blistering statement condemning the broadcaster's behaviour and its role in deepening his mother's isolation. But in 1995, none of that was yet known. All the public saw was a princess, poised and softly spoken, revealing the truth that had been whispered for years. A fairy tale gone sour. A palace of mirrors, reflecting nothing but contradictions. The monarchy could survive scandal, but surviving transparency? That was new. And while Diana's voice may have stirred global sympathy, not every royal scandal had such gravitas. Some were just absurd, unfathomably awkward. The sort that made Buckingham Palace wish telephoto lenses had never been invented. Like the time a duchess vacationed topless and made headlines for her toes. Sarah, Duchess of York, 1992-2010. The British monarchy has always had its eccentric outliers, those royal adjacents who manage to stay just close enough to be seen, yet far enough to act freely. Sarah Ferguson, the Duchess of York, was one of those figures. Red-haired, larger than life, famously less buttoned up than her royal in-laws, and never quite in step with the Windsor's brand of starchy decorum. She entered the royal family in 1986, marrying Prince Andrew, and for a while seemed to inject the institution with a dose of mischief it didn't know it needed. But it didn't last. By the early 1992, her marriage was already strained. Andrew's naval career kept him away for long stretches, and Fergie, as the tabloids called her, was increasingly on her own, facing relentless press scrutiny, lonely palace corridors, and a royal family that didn't quite know what to do with her unruly charisma. Then came 1992, the year everything fell apart. While staying at a villa in the south of France, Fergie was photographed sunbathing topless beside her financial advisor, John Bryan. More specifically, she was pictured having her toes kissed by him while reading a newspaper. The photos were taken with a long lens and plastered across British front pages like a scandalous cartoon. The Duchess of York had gone from royal rebel to tabloid goldmine overnight. The images were seen as deeply embarrassing to the monarchy, not just for their content, but for the narrative they reinforced, that the Windsors were unravelling. The Queen was reportedly furious. Fergie was staying at Balmoral when the story broke and was swiftly ushered out the back door. It was the royal version of being ghosted. No confrontation, just a quiet exile. Her separation from Prince Andrew had already been announced earlier that year. After the toe-sucking saga, any chance of reconciliation was extinguished. The couple divorced in 1996 but remained unusually close, raising eyebrows but also winning some reluctant admiration for their co-parenting and lingering loyalty. For most ex-royals, this would have been the end of the story, but Fergie has never been one for quiet exits. In 2010, she made headlines again, this time for an undercover sting operation. Caught on tape by a News of the World reporter posing as a businessman, she was seen offering access to Prince Andrew for a reported £500,000. "That opens up everything you would ever wish for," she said, smiling over a glass of wine. The footage was damning. She was not a royal anymore, but she was still selling the scent of royalty and doing it sloppily. Public reaction was swift and brutal. Critics accused her of cashing in on her connections. Supporters noted her dire financial situation, pointing to a lifetime of poor business ventures and heavy debt. She apologized, claiming she had been in the gutter, desperate, and drinking too much at the time. But the damage to her reputation already scarred deepened. Yet somehow, Fergie endured. She has always had a strange resilience. Unpolished, occasionally chaotic, and completely out of sync with royal tradition. She has remained in the Windsor orbit. Invited to family events, seen walking dogs with the Queen, treated like a beloved embarrassment, never fully embraced, never fully banished. Her scandals weren't matters of state. They didn't alter the line of succession or destabilize the crown. But they mattered because they highlighted the fragility of the royal facade. That behind the titles and tiaras were people fallible, impulsive, sometimes absurdly human. And if anyone still believed that the younger generation would escape such pitfalls, that modern royals would learn from the mistakes of the past, they hadn't seen what would happen next. Because just when the monarchy thought it had made peace with scandal, a prince would walk into a costume party wearing a swastika, and the photos would make sure the whole world saw. Harry Controversies, 2005-2012. Prince Harry has always carried the double burden of royal privilege and public scrutiny, forever the spare to William's heir, and often the reluctant star of the monarchy's more tabloid-friendly chapters. But while most royals are trained from an early age to veil their humanity beneath polished protocol, Harry never quite got the memo. His mistakes weren't discreet. They were messy, headline-making, and often involved fancy dress or a suspicious lack of clothing altogether. Let's start with 2005, the Nazi uniform scandal. In January of that year, the British press published a photo of 20-year-old Prince Harry at a private costume party, dressed in military attire, complete with a swastika armband. The theme of the party? Colonials and natives. You'd be forgiven for thinking this was 1905. The image, snapped by a fellow partygoer, hit the front page of The Sun under the headline, Harry the Nazi. The fallout was immediate. Politicians condemned the costume, Holocaust survivors expressed horror, public opinion, even among monarchists, was openly appalled. Buckingham Palace released a rare personal apology from Harry, who said he was very sorry if I caused any offence and acknowledged it was a poor choice, but the damage was significant. The image didn't just suggest bad taste, it raised uncomfortable questions about judgment, entitlement, and the bubble that royal life so often creates. Behind the scenes, the scandal reportedly prompted serious conversations within the palace. Harry was already seen as a party prince, known for clubbing, drinking, and occasionally fighting with paparazzi. But this incident marked a turning point. The moment when private misbehavior collided irrevocably with global visibility. In the years that followed, Harry tried to rehabilitate his image. He enrolled at Sandhurst, joined the British Army, and served 2 tours in Afghanistan. He became, to many, a redeemed figure maturing under pressure, finding purpose in service. His military career earned him genuine respect, especially from veterans. For a time it seemed the worst was behind him. Then came Las Vegas. In August 2012, TMZ published grainy cell phone photos of Harry completely nude clutching his crown jewels in a high-rise hotel suite while playing strip billiards. The shots showed Harry horsing around with several other party guests, seemingly carefree and completely unaware that someone had pulled out a camera phone. Once again, Buckingham Palace confirmed the images were real. Once again, Harry apologized, though this time, public reaction was more split. Some scolded him for immaturity, others laughed it off as harmless fun. But for the palace, it was another PR nightmare, especially given Harry's recent efforts to position himself as a serious public figure. And this wasn't just a private embarrassment. It played directly into a broader narrative that the younger royals were out of touch, insulated from consequences, and dependent on taxpayer-funded security while behaving like celebrity bachelors on spring break. For a public still wrestling with austerity and growing Republican sentiment, the image of a naked prince partying in a $7,000 a night suite landed poorly. The incident also hinted at a deeper tension. Harry was living in a role he hadn't chosen, under a spotlight he didn't enjoy, with expectations he had little interest in meeting. His behavior may have been reckless, but it was also symptomatic, a manifestation of a man who felt simultaneously trapped and scrutinized. Years later, when Harry began publicly distancing himself from royal life, these early scandals were reframed as part of that larger journey. His struggles with the press, his battles with mental health, his resentment of invasive coverage, all had roots in the years when his mistakes became tabloid spectacle. But in 2012, no such framing existed. He was still a working royal, still expected to uphold the dignity of the crown, still held to a standard he wasn't prepared or willing to meet. And as the palace worked overtime to contain the fallout, another, far graver scandal was already brewing, one that couldn't be dismissed as youthful mischief or drunken antics. A scandal that wouldn't involve photos but lawsuits. Not pranks but allegations. And at the center of it all, Harry's uncle. And a name that had already become synonymous with silence, power, and the kind of secrets that monarchies are built to survive. Prince Andrew and Jeffrey Epstein. For years, Prince Andrew was known as the Queen's most affable son. A Royal Navy veteran, helicopter pilot during the Falklands War, and once dubbed Air Miles Andy for his globe-trotting lifestyle, he had long cultivated the image of a gregarious, harmless figure fond of golf, wealthy friends, and post-divorce bachelorhood. But in the 2010 second, that image disintegrated. What emerged was something darker. Something that made even the most scandal-weary royal watchers recoil. At the center of the collapse was Andrew's decades-long association with Jeffrey Epstein. Epstein, wealthy financier, convicted sex offender, and serial abuser, was no stranger to powerful circles. His social roster included billionaires, academics, former presidents, and at least one prince. Andrew's ties to Epstein dated back to the 1992nd. They vacationed together, were photographed walking in Central Park. Epstein even attended Princess Beatrice's 18th birthday at Windsor Castle. After Epstein's 2008 conviction for procuring a minor for prostitution, most of his high-profile friends quietly cut ties. Not Andrew. In 2010, he was photographed walking with Epstein in New York's Central Park after Epstein had served jail time. The images sparked immediate outrage. What was a senior royal doing with a convicted sex offender? The palace offered no convincing answers. But the scandal didn't fade. In 2015, Virginia Giuffre, formerly Roberts, filed a legal claim stating that she had been trafficked by Epstein and forced to have intimate encounters with Prince Andrew on multiple occasions when she was a minor under US law. She provided photographs, including one showing her with Andrew, his arm around her waist, and Ghislaine Maxwell grinning in the background. Andrew denied everything. He claimed he had no recollection of ever meeting Giuffre. He suggested the photo might be doctored. He even said he had a medical condition that prevented him from sweating a detail intended to dispute part of her testimony, and one that became instant headline fodder. But nothing topped the train wreck of his 2019 BBC Newsnight interview. Seeking to clear his name, Andrew sat down with journalist Emily Mightless in what was supposed to be a clarifying, vindicating conversation. Instead, it became one of the most catastrophic public relations disasters in royal history. He appeared arrogant, evasive, and shockingly unaware of how deeply out of touch he sounded. He didn't express regret for his friendship with Epstein, only that it had become inconvenient. He defended his stay at Epstein's mansion as a matter of honor. He insisted that on one of the nights in question, he was at a Pizza Express in Woking with his daughter. The detail became a national punchline, but the overall effect was damning. Within days, his royal duties were stepped back. His public appearances vanished. Charitable ties were severed. His military titles suspended. The Queen, reportedly devastated, issued no statement, but the message was clear. Andrew was out. In 2022, Andrew settled Giuffre's civil lawsuit out of court, reportedly paying millions. He admitted no liability. The palace, again, remained silent. Unlike earlier royal scandals, torrid affairs, phone calls, embarrassing photos, this was different. This was criminal, international, morally toxic. The monarchy had always been adept at surviving scandal by cloaking it in pageantry and detachment. But this was scandal with a body count, a name Epstein that carried global baggage, a victim who wouldn't be silenced, and a prince who couldn't hide behind the usual excuses. Prince Andrew's fall from grace wasn't loud. It was quiet. A vanishing act in slow motion. No exile, no formal disgrace, just a fading figure, no longer waved at in parades or listed on royal websites. A son still protected, perhaps, but no longer celebrated. And with that, we come full circle, not to resolution, but to reflection. 33 scandals, stretching from Norman forests to Buckingham Palace boardrooms, some absurd, some tragic. All human, all royal, and none of them fully resolved. Because that's the real legacy of monarchy, not perfection, but spectacle. Not clarity, but contradiction. A pageant of privilege and fragility, stitched together by ceremony and undone, again and again, by the ordinary chaos of human behavior.